Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us from all over the world for our event, Nowruz, the Iranian New Year from Myth to History. My name is Shiva Tabatabai-Nejad. I'm an alumna of Georgetown School of Foreign Service and Persian Studies program. I will be assisting with the question and answer portion of the event. If at any time you'd like to pose a question, please use the Q&A box so that our presenter may see it at an opportune time. There will be a designated Q&A portion. Questions, as always, are welcome in both Persian, English, or Finglish. I have the pleasure of introducing the founder and director of the Persian Studies program at Georgetown University, Professor Fatima Mostofi.
خانم‌ها آقایان سلام. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our 445 attendees from around the globe. On behalf of the Persian Studies program of Georgetown University, I would like to welcome you to Nowruz, the Iranian New Year from Myth to History, our fourth Jalinous lecture series in the form of a webinar and our second event in the year 2021. We truly value your ongoing support and interest in our cultural events. We will have another event on April 23rd, the Canticles of the Birds, Manteqotir. Please allow me also to express my sincere appreciation to the Jalinous family, without whom these cultural events would not take place. I now have the pleasure of introducing our presenter, Dr. Touraj Daryaee. Dr. Daryaee is the Masseeh Chair in Persian Studies and Culture, Director of the Dr. Samuel M. Jordan Center for Persian Studies and Culture at the University of California, Irvine. Dr. Daryaee's research has focused on ancient and early medieval history of Iran, specifically the Sasanian Empire. He is the author of many books and articles. Indeed, his Sasanian Persia, The Rise and Fall of an Empire, is received the award of British Society for Middle Eastern Studies in 2010. He is also the editor of the Nameh Iran Bastan, the International Journal of Ancient Iranian Studies, as well as the electronic journal Dabir, the late Antique Near East Project. We are very privileged indeed to have Dr. Daryaee today for his presentation, Nowruz, the Iranian New Year, from Myth to History. I turn it over to you, Dr. Daryaee. Nowruz Mubarak to everyone.
Ladies and gentlemen, خانم آقایان, نوروزتون مبارک. Happy New Year as it's coming up. It is a privilege and honor to be invited to Georgetown University to deliver the Jalinous lectures. And I thank the Jalinous family for really creating a venue where more subjects related to Iranian studies could be presented. I'd like to thank Dr. Mostofi, Ms. Tabatabai-Nejad for the invitation, and also Candace, who is saving our lives here on Zoom. What I would like to discuss are tangential issues related to what we call the Iranian New Year, the Persian New Year, or whoever celebrates the Nowruz. On today, of course, these days, March 21st, spring equinox, at least since the 11th century when the calendar was fixed. So I would like to discuss some of the issues regarding to the myth and how the story sort of came into being and then end in history. I will add a little bit of a personal touch because I think it's sometimes nice to wove in some personal experience in regards to an issue at hand, such as the New Year, let's say, or Jamshid, as you're seeing him in this beautiful manuscript sitting on his throne, right, on his takht, and being whisked away, is supposed to fly, obviously, with the aid of Deevs, what we now in Persian call the demons. So if you allow me, I will now begin. So Nowruz, and it's spelled various ways in the English, of course, letters or Latin letters, or Nowruz as it's known, is a celebration that takes place in a large swath of the globe now. Traditionally, from Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, all the way bordering in China, to today's Syria, where, of course, the Kurds, Iranian speaking people live, it is celebrated. And of course, all the way to the Caucasus, from the Republic of Azerbaijan down south to Oman. So again, the territory, of course, is quite large. And so Iranian speaking and non-Iranian speaking people have celebrated this, and this is because of this cultural contact. And so Kurds, Baluch, and Persians, and Azeris, and a whole group of people, Uzbeks and others, actually celebrate this in various ways. There's not a uniform way of course, celebrating it. Many people have immigrated from this traditional parts of Asia and have gone to places like the United States. So you see that Nowruz is celebrated in the West, that is in Europe and parts of Africa, even obviously, for example, Zanzibar, and also the American continent. So it's a wide-ranging, actually, celebration. It's not a small one, and it is indeed an ancient one. But the question is, how old? If you ask people, those who have celebrated this tradition, and here the Tajiks are doing it officially with pomp and circumstances, one group of Iranian speakers, here are the Kurds, another group of Iranian speakers who are doing it in their own traditional way of lighting bonfire, they will tell you that this is a very old tradition. Okay, so it's old. How old? In fact, what is interesting in terms of historical documentation, we only have evidence as late as the Sasanian period, when the Sasanian Empire, which called its empire Iran Shah, the realm of Iranians, which was traditionally from the Oxus Seen River to the Euphrates River, as this sort of realm. We know that the Sasanian Persian king, according to early Islamic sources, the king, as you're seeing his coinage here, this is a gold dinar. The king, during the New Year, gave dinars and dirhams of the year. So these coins were minted every year for the Sasanian kings. We know of the mint place for the later times, and also their date. So every year for that year, the coin that was minted, some of it was given out as presents. And more beautifully, our sources tell us that these coins that I was a child, I remember in Iran receiving small gold coins, which was, of course, kept by our parents. This was done almost 1800 years ago or 1500 years ago, where coins actually were put in lemon, quince, or an apple and distributed. I think this is quite beautiful. And I think the distribution of the fruits itself should tell us that this is lemon, quince, and apple, maybe something related to the autumn period. So maybe the Nowruz is not fixed as a date. We further know that if Nowruz fell on a Sabbath, because the calendar was moving, and then the Jewish population would receive a huge sum of coinage as Nowruz present. And you could see that already it is not a tradition that is becoming only related to one religious community, but it's becoming beyond religious divides. And that's why Nowruz is then celebrated when we know in the early Islamic times, the best, of course, person who has given us information is Biruni around 1000, where Iranians were Muslim in Baghdad. They were making food all through the night, throwing water at each other, really amazing ceremonies that even the caliph enjoyed, as we're told. And so it became moved from a specifically Zoroastrian, absolutely in its origin, to a pan-Iranian and then beyond this Iranian world. So that is the earliest really evidence that we have in terms of a textual evidence reflecting on the Sasanian period. But what about before that? We obviously think of images of Persepolis as a possible relation. And it was Ernst Herzfeld, an important German archaeologist who really excavated Pasargadae. Initially, his dissertation was actually with the identification of Pasargadae and the tomb with that of Cyrus the Great, but also took part in excavations at Persepolis. That in exactly 1941, he suggested that what we are seeing as if some of the friezes on Persepolis, what we call today in Persian Takht-e Jamshid, is really a scenery of celebration. And that celebration is the New Year. And I want you to see these either Medes or Persians, however we want to identify the felt caps, with the akinakis, the short swords, are holding flowers, holding each other's hands. This is something to think about. It is a festive atmosphere. And some of these other scholars, such as Edith Porada, important art historian in Columbia University, and others, went along with such idea. Exactly 50 years after Herzfeld's suggestion, Helene Sanchisi Wirdenborg, in a very interesting article, which was called Nowruz at Persepolis, put together all the sources or all the discussion for pros and cons of whether Nowruz was celebrated at Persepolis. I don't think she came to a conclusive conclusion, but she presented both sides of the story as it could be or not. I would like to really discuss tangentially this issue of Persepolis as a monument, as a structure, and its relations to the Nowruz. So we will see this shortly. But whether Persepolis was an administrative center, and certainly the Persepolis fortification archives, the tablets attest to that, or if it was also a ritual center, can sort of push us to this idea. And indeed, it was also a ritual center. We have the finds of plates, but mortars and pestles in Aramaic. So these are ritual objects, which we think Hauma, the sacred plant, the Indo-Iranian Salma Hauma, was crushed at some sort of ceremony, as the Aramaic texts tell us. So it had ritual center. And Mary Boyce has suggested, since we have a notice by the Greek sources that in Persepolis the king appeared in autumn for some celebration, it probably was what would be in Old Persian Mitrakana or Mehragan, rather than Nowruz. Now, I think if Mehragan was celebrated, obviously Nowruz was also celebrated. The two important, I think, holidays and festivals, seasonal festivals. So if one was celebrated, the other one must have been celebrated as well. Now, coming to the Shahnameh, the Persian Book of Kings, which give us really the story that most people are attuned to about the origins of Shahnameh, is a mythic tradition. And that is the story of this culture hero king who creates the four classes, puts the world in order, creates everything that is needed for this actually world, is Jamshid. And King Jamshid, as Dick Davis's translation reads, then he ordered the demons to mix clay and water and pack the mixture into molds for bricks. And this is this beautiful depiction of the Shahnameh book by Rahmanian and translation of Dr. Sadri, Professor Sadri. And in one specific, of course, scene that they have created beautifully, you could see that demons are literally making the bricks the walls. And I want to just emphasize the wall making and the brick making issue in the myth of Shahnameh about Jamshid and the Nowruz. So these, again, bricks are put together as a wall. And the story continues with his royal far, glory. This is usually in the Iranian world reflected this glory as a nimbus. And you can see Jamshid, again, Rahmanian's creation, the nimbus is shining. And in fact, Jamshid has the most glory, is quite luminous. And so with his royal glory, he constructed a throne studded with gems and had demons raise him aloft from the earth into the heavens. There he sat on his throne like the sun shining in the sky. Again, Davis's translation. And of course, the last part of the story of the Nowruz in the Shahnameh goes as such. The world's creatures gathered in wonder about him and scattered jewels on him and called this day the new day, or Nowruz. And here's a celebration again by Rahmanian's depiction, which reminds me very much of the Kurdish celebration of the fire. So that is in essence, the story that most of us know. It's the Jamshid as a king, as a culture hero. So that is what is current in the Persian literary tradition. However, I want to push you back a little bit and discuss this luminous culture hero, this king named Jamshid. And Jamshid in the Avestan, older Eastern Iranian tradition, circa 1000 to let's say 500 BCE, is known as Yimas. And his epitaph is Cheshaitia. And so Yima Cheshaitia, which through contraction becomes Jamshid or Jamshid, simply means the shining Yima. And this shining Yima, which is Jamshid, in the Avesta, as Jean Kellens has most recently discussed, is the ruler of a paradise. So in the Avestan tradition, in fact, Jamshid was the creator or sort of the maintainer of a paradise. And I think that is somehow related to what we are talking here. So what is this paradise? Well, Jamshid in the Videvdad, which is part of the Avesta, Videvdad means simply anti-demonic law, an important part of the Avesta. In Videvdad 2, the story of Jamshid is beautifully told. And of course, as Yima here, Yima Cheshait, where there's a harsh winter, and it's the work of demons. And now Yima is told to build a vara. In Avestan, it's vara. In Middle Persian is var or var, and in Persian is divar, which simply means wall. I think cognate with English wall, which gives us our Sanskrit vala, fortress. So an enclosure, basically. Now, this enclosure could be in many ways, but basically it gives us, sort of takes us back, if you just remember, to our wall that is being built in the Shahnameh. We already in the Avesta, in the Videvdad, we're getting this story of the wall building. And in the Videvdad, the story goes as, then Jam, meaning Jamshid, made that enclosure, that var, the length of a racecourse on each of its four sides, brought together there the seeds of small and large animals. He made water, he made indestructible food, because it's paradise. He established houses there which have short walls, divar. So again, this theme of the wall, I wanted to stay with you. The Videvdad continues. He brought there the seeds of all men and women. He brought together there the seeds of all the species of beneficent animals, all the plants, all the foods that are the sweetest. So this is this enclosure and what's in it. You could sort of see this paradise of everything beautiful in it. They live the happiest life. That is, they never die in these enclosures. After all, it's paradise. You're not going to die. And you live actually as an ideal age that Jam made. So I think this story of the wall building of the Shahnameh and Jamshid setting things into motion really goes back to the Avestan Zoroastrian tradition in the chapter 2 of the Vidavdat. So this walled enclosure that is most beautiful. When we think of that, at least to me, it brings up the Achaemenid sort of period term that we have in its median form, paradaisa, which should give us the Old Persian paradaida, which basically means a round wall, a walled, basically a garden, as we are told later according to Greek tradition, which then enters into Greek as paradisos. And then, of course, the notion of this walled garden as a paradise has stayed with us of course, in the Christian tradition. But as Bruce Lincoln has shown, this idea of a walled garden, a paradisus, a paradise, a walled garden, it existed in Zoroastrian tradition. And so it's a Zoroastrian idea of this paradise, the walled garden that enters into the Abrahamic tradition. Now it's interesting that when the Russian archaeologists such as Viktor Saryanidi in the 50s and 60s was excavating in Central Asia, we knew very little about these humongous forts, and this may be Gunur Tepe. But I want you to see this walled enclosure. And it's interesting that more recently, not only Saryanidi's idea that this may have been the original inhabitant or one of the areas where the early Iranian speakers came and stayed, called the BMAC area, the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex. And that is this imagination of Yimas, this walled enclosure, may in fact be related to these structures in the Bactria Margiana region. But more recently, the Italian scholar Vidale in the Journal of Indo-European Studies has suggested that in fact the recent spectacular finds in Girov in southeastern Iran with these structures has been studied by him. And in terms of windows and doors and the shining of light, he suggests that in fact some of this may be also reflecting this amazing story of Jamshid or Yimas and the Vara, this walled structure. And this in fact is round. Here we can see it square as it is done in the Avesta. So this, I think, in itself is quite interesting to think about the story of this walled paradise that Jamshid built, where then in the Shahnameh, Jamshid becomes, of course, this cultural hero king who does this. Now, I want to do an excursus and come back to Persepolis and also give you a personal narrative. I had the distinct and amazing pleasure that I was allowed to spend a night by myself at Persepolis, the ceremonial, I would say, capital of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. And that night was, of course, being one of the most important nights of my life. It was a bit cold, but it was dark and it was beautiful, and the lights came on. Of course, there were small lights on the monuments, and I sat there. And I began to ask myself, why do us Iranians call this place Takhte Jamshid, Yimas' throne? Is it Jamshid's throne here? How could that be? When did this idea come into being? And for a second, I tried to put my scholarly hat aside and act as an Iranian, let's say, living in late antiquity, who knows his Vidavdat, his Avestan, because as a good Zoroastrian, you should have known, and to sit and look at this monument and ask, well, what does this Takht, this huge area, has to do in common with this Takht, where Yimas is supposed to be sitting? And then I had epiphany. My epiphany was this: as I was looking at the Apadana reliefs, as you can see, here you see Syrians and Lydians, of course, as we know in the scholarly world, bringing perhaps presents to the king. Some people have, of course, discussed this in terms of the Baji or Bajdadan, sort of the annual gift that the different satrapies and provinces gave. But we should again think of Herzfeld's a place of celebration. I thought of the Vidavdat or Vendidat 2 story, where Yimas or Jam placed two of everything, or the best of species, best objects, best in the world, and had a wall, a paradise built around it, a walled paradise. And could we, as Iranians living in late antiquity and early medieval, knowing our Western tradition, by looking at this wall, could we sort of actually think that this is where the Yimas story took place? That is a story that probably took place in the Bimak region in Central Asia by the Iranians of antiquity, or at least late antiquity, is being viewed as Takht Jamshid. The Yimas throne is there if you think you know the tradition. And this was sort of my, again, great epiphany, which I wrote a brief article on. And to give, I think, more credence to this idea that the Yimas throne was there, and the idea of Takht Jamshid being related with some sort of celebration of Nowruz, or celebrated, is this image of the Kuh Rahmat, which in Middle Persian text, in a Zoroastrian encyclopedic text called the Bundaheshan, Book of Original Creation, it says Ur, which is a city, and Yima made enclosure. In Middle Persian, it's Varejam Kar. That means it's a place that Yima has created, is in the middle of Pars, province of Pars, by Sarvak. It said that the Yima made enclosure, Varejam Kar, is under Mount Jamagan. Now, Jamagan or Yamakan, that is the mountain of Yima, has now been identified with Kur Rahmat. So when we see that already in the Zoroastrian text, at some time, Yima's throne, and this is a throne, of course, that is part of the story of the New Year, right, as a sort of essence, is thought to have been this location. So we come back to Persepolis as a ceremonial center, and I think at some time it was thought that the Nowruz, the new day or the new year, was related to the structure of Persepolis. Perhaps we don't know if it was the Achaemenid period already, but certainly by the late ancient period. And Jamshid's throne was this actually structure. And it was there in this enclosure, under it, where all the good things and objects were kept. So I think I have spoken my half an hour, and I thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Daryaee. I'm going to open it up for the Q&A portion. Let me know. I'm sure Candace will figure it out as far as the presentation wise, but we do have a lot of good questions. One of the questions in relation to the demons you were just discussing, we had a question of, are these demons the same as the English connotation of demon, or is it?
Yeah. We're seeing both questions that I have here are about demons. You should remember the term Daiva, Div, originally in Iranian and Indo-Iranian world means gods. There are one set of deities actually, right? In the early Indo-Iranian period, you have two major classes of deities or gods: the Asuras or the Ahuras, and the Daivas. It just happens, interestingly, in most, and not in every, all of the Iranian sort of world, but in most of them, the Daivas simply just mean the fallen gods. They are the fallen gods, while in the, again, in the Indic world, they are the gods, right? They're the chosen gods. And the Ahuras or the Asuras make their sort of appearance as important. But in the Caspian region, we get lots of people with the name Divashtij in the medieval times. We get Div Salar as contemporary names. I think on the Caspian, you have the residual of these fallen gods who were still gods, and their names are being, interestingly, I think, used in the Iranian world in the north.
Wow. Okay. Amazing. And then we just had another we have a few
Yeah,
questions.
I'm reading now. This are coming
They're
down
coming in.
Rapidly.
Yes, they are. I do have a couple of questions that I do want to ask that I know some of the students in the Persian Studies program at Georgetown have also asked, so I will sprinkle in a couple of their questions. One that I thought was very interesting is Nowruz has lasted through millennia, but do you think Nowruz will come to an end at one point in time?
And not only I think that it will not come to an end, but with this huge migration of Iranian-speaking people and their expansion, it is going to get even more press. So when I go to my local Trader Joe's across the street today, you see that Sombol is placed there and it says Happy Nowruz. So in fact, what is happening is my sort of American friends are here celebrating Nowruz, and they are becoming curious. And I think this is happening in different places in the West as well. So actually, it's going to grow and become even more important.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. And why is there the tradition of the Halfscene or
You,
the Halfscene?
this is my knowledge, and this is really rudimentary.
Okay.
At least we know what we set as a table as a Halfscene in Iran, basically, right? And those who come from Iran is a modern phenomenon, maybe 100 years ago. I would suggest that you read the late Dr. Shapur Shahbaz's entry in Encyclopedia Iranica on the Halfscene, which that is really, we don't have much older evidence. And it wouldn't be Halfscene because Sharab or Shah, these are Arabic terms. So it wouldn't have been actually the pre-Islamic version. That doesn't work. But the relation to the Amshah Spandan, the seven bounteous immortals, and that has been a suggestion. But also, remember, this was probably a seasonal holiday. So the coming of sort of the Sabzeh and Sib and these things may just be a seasonal feast that people put in. But you should remember, I think in Uzbekistan, in Tajikistan, they don't do that. So this is really what we think is an Irano-centric, modern-day Iranian view of things, rather than when the Kurds lit fire in Syria, let's say, or to make some sort of ash in Tajikistan. People do it differently, and that's, I think, the beauty of it. There's no single way.
And that, I think, is a great segue into the next question of, originally we had this listed as the Persian New Year, but we changed it to Iranian New Year to be more inclusive. So we have a question from a former student in Uzbekistan. Why Nowruz the Iranian New Year myth or history?
Absolutely.
Yeah, please.
So the reason I had to change from Persian to Iranian is, first of all, within the Iranian world, the Iranian-speaking people are the first people who celebrated it. Who are these? Persians, Kurds, Baluchis, and others, right? As this empire expanded, culturally, it was so significant that the celebration of these people was adopted by its neighbors, right? And wherever these Iranian-speaking people, Iranian speakers went all the way to Khotan, Western China, right? We have Khotanists. And they brought their celebrations, the Sogdins in the Middle Ages, the medieval period. So that's why it's an Iranian, and then it was adopted by people now all over the world. More than 30 countries celebrate.
Yeah, yeah. And you were talking about the Halfscene in the last 100 years and modern ways in which people are celebrating. We do have a couple of questions about how that has changed since the Iranian Revolution in '79 and whether or not the current government favors such celebrations such as Nowruz or ambivalent.
I think, again, not to get into politics per se, since before and after revolution, we've had the Halfscene, we've got the AD. Now, I think when the revolutionary zeal was high at the beginning of the revolution, and this idea of Islamism was being promoted, there were tensions, which some of the probably clerics were saying that this may be not a kosher celebration. Okay. However, we should remember this thing has been going on for at least 2,500 or 2,000 years. And it's been so strong and powerful and celebratory that people with different religions have been celebrating it. And I do not think any religious injunction by anyone can really stop this celebration. It's larger than any one religion or I think tradition.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I know that in some tables of Halfscene, someone will have the Hafiz, but then another home will have like the Quran. So as far as when that crossover happened, do you think just because it's such a so welcoming of all religions that any?
It's also somewhat political and ideological, right? If you celebrate it as a national holiday, like Persian Jews, they may put their Torah there, right? The Zoroastrian put their Avesta there, right? I remember I have a picture when I teach modern Iran once in a while of the last Shah of Iran's celebration of the Nowruz was put the Pahlavi Quran there with the picture of Hazrat Ali. So, this is part of whichever family and tradition has had that tradition. Today's people who want to be have had a reaction to this Islamic revolution, they tend to put the Hafiz, some people the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings. It is to your pleasure. And, that's, I think, the beauty of this. There's no one who can tell you or should tell you it should be celebrated as such. It's diversity, it's its beauty.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and we have gotten a couple of questions about Haji Firuz and whether or not that's culturally dated, his significance. How does he know?
Again, I do not know. There are myths associated with it.
Okay.
Also with the killing of the Caliph Omar, who was responsible for the major conquest of Iran. And but I really don't know. And these cultural sort of folk traditions pop up, and sometimes it's never recorded. It's just accepted. Of course, in current atmosphere, this is of course looked upon very differently, and that's a discussion healthy to have it in the West, and so on. But I really don't know.
Okay, no, completely fair. Going to a couple of our questions over here from our audience. Do you think Cyrus the Great celebrated Nowruz? And is Nowruz related to the birth of Zoroaster, like Christianity?
Nowruz is not related to the birth of Zoroaster. We know in the Zoroastrian calendar, you have this Hamas Patmaidia. It's a celebration of the last 10 days, Panjay Kuchago Panjay Bozorg, just before the New Year, where it is believed that the spirit of the dead of your family come home. This is a Zoroastrian tradition. And so what people did was to clean their houses, wear new clothes, waiting for the spirit of their ancestors to show. And that is called the Farvardinagan celebration. So it's more related probably to Farvardinagan celebration than really the birth of Zoroaster, which we don't, later on we have a tradition associated with it, but we don't have the exact date initially.
Okay, great. And we have a lot of questions, so apologies if I'm just throwing them at you.
Only the ones that I know, of course. No.
Of course.
No, it should be clear.
Yeah, definitely. So we have someone who's asked, I've heard previously that Jamshid had a cup called Jam Jam. Is this part of the original Nowruz story, or is it something from the Avesta?
Yeah, this is a beautiful story that later on is added. And in fact, it's really interesting to see the parallel in the Iranian tradition with Jam Jamshid, which is beautifully put into, of course, medieval Persian poetry, right? Khayyam and others would have sort of invoked this, but also to think of the Grail. We know that the Sasanians in the 7th century are said to have taken the Holy Grail and brought it back to Iran. And there are two actually, or one really interesting German medieval myth that actually the Grail is in Takob, close to Takob. It's in Shiz, the sacred fire temple of Shiz, and it's been put into that water. And I think there is some sort of a borrowing ideas between the Grail of Jesus, the Grail, and that of Jamshid, which is, I think, a later interpolation. But beside that, I wouldn't know.
Definitely. We have a question from someone in Afghanistan who is asking if you could speak a little bit more about the spiritual and civilizational values of Nowruz and strengthening the cultural ties of countries that celebrate Nowruz. He says
absolutely
he wants more people in Afghanistan to know about the values and the importance of Nowruz.
Yeah, it's celebrations that binds people together. Sometimes it's very close and religious. Some of it becomes beyond national ideas, right? That's why our friend in Uzbekistan was asking. This is a time that, first of all, at Nowruz, people should really, as we say in Persian, kudurat ha ro be kenar bogzarim. We should leave aside all the ill wills that we've had to people during the year. We haven't talked to them, to reach back to them. It's a period of friendship, right? That is very important. Second is the celebration. When I sit here in Irvine, California, and I see my friend in Uzbekistan, right, in Samarkand is celebrating it, right, and our friends in Kabul, John, or in another place, right, Kandahar, or Balkh, which I love, or Herat, or in northern Iraq, right? It's really a festive idea, and you feel some sort of connection, and I think that's what is important, and it's great to then read the Persian Book of Kings, I guess, to see of this story to be told.
Yeah, yeah. And I know we talked about demons and you said they were like fallen gods. Is that how they're seen in Shahnameh too? We have a question about the significance.
No, in the Shahnameh already it's 11th century. So Div is a demon. But also in the Shahnameh, you have the story of Divs teaching humans how to write, right? There is a story, I think it's with Human, of writing different scripts. I think Dr. Almuzavar has also written about this. That here we're talking about, it's probably the gods, the old gods that are teaching writing. It's not demonic in its nature. And that's just because what Div means in Persian after the Zoroastrian reform.
Mhm, mhm. Okay, and we have another person who has asked or who's commented that Easter always falls on the first Sunday after the first full moon after Nowruz. Any comment on this? I think they want to know if that's.
No, it is interesting, yes, that when dates were fixed, remember, the calendar was turning and it wasn't really fixed. It's only in the 900 years that we've had it on the specific days, the major Nowruz falls in there. And I think the Parsis have two Nowruz, by the way, because of the calendar change. That is interesting that this end for many religions have this sort of common theme of some sort of celebratory nature. But beyond that, I really am ignorant.
And okay, great. And just in discussion with Persepolis, we have a question of, is there carbon or DNA evidence at Persepolis of the range of animals and plants that would have lived there?
Ah, that's very interesting. I'm interested in animals and plants. Already, what we see on the Apadana, of course, reliefs are plants from the different reaches of the empire. In a sense, the center is showing off its reach, right? It's if you imagine like a museum, like the British Museum or the Louvre, right? Or the New York Met Museum. What they do is they take objects, these empires, these centers of power at sometimes colonial powers, of different objects and put them there for you to see. First of all, you learn, obviously, that's what we think about. But ideologically, it's telling us, look where we can go and what we can decipher and see. It's that power. In a way, I would look at Persepolis Apadana reliefs as celebratory. Those people holding hands and smelling flowers are not there to give baji or their taxes to the king. I don't think that does. But the cypress trees from, let's say, Cyprus or from Lebanon, the cedar wood, or the gilded work from Lydians, that does suggest some sort of, different species and different plants. But already, I think Xenophon discusses that in these Persian paradises that the Achaemenids were building, they had an immense taste for gardening and putting every kind of beautiful animal and plants in there. And that's what the image of paradise, of course, is. So the idea of horticulture and bringing different plants is certainly very much keen with the Achaemenid Persians, although we should mention that the Assyrians had already toyed with this idea. The Assyrians had also had this idea when they created their empire. It's just that the Persian Empire coincides with the Greek narratives, and that's why we get so much of this Persianate world in the Greek text.
Great. As in discussion with the paradise and these plants, we have two questions about plants and the paradise. One is, do we know what the Hayoma plant was, and was it ritually used during the Nowruz festival? And then the second question is, did the notion of Jamshid's paradise influence how Persian cities were organized and how kings hoped to rule?
Beautiful.
Was Jamshid's paradise the ideal?
Beautiful. I think this second question is a very interesting and important question. I often remember Iranian plateau is an arid region, right? It has greens in the north and pockets, of course, through time, and climactic issues, it has changed. But when you look in Kerman, for example, or in Yazd, or Kashan, which my family, mother's family are from, like Waghifin, right? You see these gardens in the middle of nowhere in this arid region that it's so green. That is the paradise that is being created in every location. And these bogs and gardens are, I think, a mirror image of these paradise of Jamshid, this walled gardens of the Achaemenid, the paradisas. And of course, when we look at Persian carpets, you should again remember the four corners with the flowers inside. That is, I think, again, another mimicking of this paradisical sort of state of mind in a very arid place. Okay, so that's the answer to number two. Number one question, Avestan Halma, Sanskrit Salma, the sacred hallucinogenic drink, which is in the Avesta is mixed with milk and honey. It is used for rituals. The yasna ceremony is its nature is not exactly known. There are various contentions from Mr. Wasson, who was a chemist who suggested it was some sort of mushroom, to ephedra by Martin Schwartz and his colleague that right now escapes my sort of my mind, or it's some sort of plant. But its original identity we don't know. But in the Zoroastrian ritual, of course, it's been substituted now with another plant, which is still called home today. But there are several books and many articles, but we really don't have conclusive, I think, evidence.
Interesting. And in that same vein, as far as traditions that have moved forward, and you were saying modern versions of the Halfscene, we have a couple of questions here of how exactly, if there's evidence, how was Nowruz celebrated at the moment of the spring equinox? Because we have a lot of people here saying it was celebrated at that moment. How did that start? How far back does that tradition go? And do any traditions from back in those times remain in modern?
11th century, when calendar is fixed, and we know the spring equinox, and there are, of course, stargazers. Iranians and others in Mesopotamia, we should remember, has a deep tradition of stargazing and sort of knowing time and keeping time, as we do in Mesoamerica, on the continent that we live in. Time and keeping time and looking at the moon and the sun is very important. So the people who were in the know, certainly by the time of the Abbasid Caliphate in the 9th century, we know this is the case. And I would contend that definitely with the Sasanian Akhtar Maran, sort of the stargazers and the star sort of experts, they could have fixed the date of the Nowruz, and it could have gone back. The problem is the paucity of our sources. We think it's old, we know it should be old, but the evidence, the literary evidence, is not there. And that makes it difficult. So you can hypothesize and make suggestions and connotations.
Sorry, this is great. We have a lot of people again asking more and more questions. What about Nowruz has led to this festival being so widely celebrated today, expanded far beyond its Zoroastrian roots?
Yeah, I mean, what happens is, my contention is, of course, with the coming of Islam, and I think Iran becomes Muslim dominantly about 1000 AD. That's, I think, a safe date for the Islamization of Iran overwhelmingly. And also for Europe, 1000 is the safe date for actually Europe becoming dominantly Christian. Okay, so it's these times. By then, it is not that when people became Muslim per se that they say, okay, I'm going to forget everything that I know and I'm going to, do something else. It is acculturation. A religion comes and it acculturates itself. It adapts, and people keep some of their old tradition and some of the new. And celebrating the New Year was so strong that no new religion, which in itself is just a religious idea, its cultural values, it's what's infused to it by other civilizations. I mean, the Islamic civilization is a construct of, the Roman sort of Near East in Syria, the Syriac-speaking, the Iranians in Iran have fused their culture into this religion to give it some sort of cultural value. And so Nowruz did survive and was celebrated. And as I said, during the Abbasid period, was so strong that the Abbasid Caliph could not would actually want to join in because he's seeing people are celebrating it. Why would you even be able to go against? I think such important celebration that at some time it wasn't connected to a specific religion anymore, right? It is Zoroastrian in tradition, absolutely, but then it became Muslim. Some Jews may have celebrated, some Christians may have celebrated,
Mm.
and pagans.
And we have a question from an attendee in India talking about
Yeah.
Nowruz is celebrated in India with Parsis. Please explain.
Yes, well, they're Iranian speakers who, by the 11th century, a large group of them decided to leave Iran. And that's when I think this year 1000 is important, where the Zoroastrians feel that really the reality is before them. And they make a journey, which is this beautiful Qisseh Sanjan, the story of Sanjan, of their appearance on the coast of India and meeting the Indian Raja or king, where they settle down. And of course, they bring their celebration and sort of their culture to India. And of course, the two merge, the Indic and the Iranian merge. And so the Parsis are really the product of this sort of really two proud traditions, but they celebrate the Nowruz and they celebrate the Nowruz Jamshidi, as they call. And I think otherwise, so they have brought the snow celebration to India. As Iranians went to East Africa in Zanzibar and brought the Nowruz celebration as it's still celebrated among the East Africans there. So again, it's beyond religion, it's beyond race and color.
And then just talking about different peoples, we have someone here saying one of our participants or attendees rather is the Yazidi people in Iraq celebrate what they call the Sooth Wednesday, and people in Iran celebrate Charshamba Sooth. How common is this tradition amongst people who celebrate Nowruz?
Yeah, this is interesting. I think this is again because of this sort of large celebration putting on bonfire, and this reminds me of the Kurdish one, and of course the Yazidis being part of that tradition as well. Charshamba Suri is a celebration that its origin may not be found, but certainly in the Persian text, and this idea of lighting fire is already there for 1,000 years, right? So on Tuesday, I'm going to go jump on over the fire as my sort of Yazidi friends are going to do it in northern Iraq, and my friends in Syria and my friends in other parts of the world. We don't have exact textual evidence, but at least for 1,000 years, we have evidence in Persian texts of lighting bonfires. Lighting fires sounds very Zoroastrian. It does feel Zoroastrian. You remember we have Sadeh, right? Which the Zoroastrians make a huge, beautiful bonfire. And so this is the smaller one that we jump over before the coming of the year to get all of our health and get all of our illnesses away.
And there's so much, significance. It feels everything is purposeful in celebration of Nowruz. We have two questions. One about the significance of the number 7 in regards to the Halfscene and whether or not 7 is culturally important. And we have another question about, is it fair to conclude that Nowruz at the beginning was the celebration based on the beginning of spring among the people whose economy was agricultural, and then little by little people from everywhere added something to it?
Yes, Zoroastrian feasts are agricultural feasts. There are several, but the two major important ones, which now, of course, are the polar opposite of date, right? It's Nowruz in spring, and then Mehregan 6 months after, right? So these are seasonal feasts of agrarian societies, and that's why it's set as such. Back to the first question, which I wanted to answer that I now completed. When you say 2, I forget.
I'm so sorry. I try to group them. The first one was the significance of the number 7.
Yeah, 7. Again, the significance of 7, at least in the Iranian tradition, is clear. From the 7 who staged the comeback or the coup, if you want to call, however you want to see it, of Darius's sort of comeback and reestablishment of order in the Achaemenid period, to Halfscene, to Hafthad, or the 7 Amshas Spandan. In the Zoroastrian tradition, the numbers 3 and 7 are quite important. Now, why 7? There are various reasons that may be given. I don't have a conclusive answer. I would suggest you read actually Haft, H-A-F-T, in Encyclopedia Iranica about the number 7 and all its significance. And again, the late Dr. Shahbazi has an interesting article on the symbolism and significance of the 7 in the Persian tradition.
Mm. And so traditionally before Nowruz, it's Charsham Suri, it's Nowruz, and then it's Sizdabadak. At least growing up, that's how I've known it orderly wise. Was Sizdabadak celebrated in ancient times?
No, and we do not know from when people began going everywhere on the 13th day, which is we call Nas, of course. But number 13, when did it become Nas? And it's sort of a belief as well, right? That we go out and celebrate, sort of finish this off and so on. So I do not know of its history and its background. Nothing in the text of old that I know of this number 13 is there. But again, I think the coming of the Fravashis, our guardian spirit, which I'm waiting for, by the way, it should be coming soon, the last 5 days or 10 days of before the new year. There are ideas of, we know earlier on, actually bonfires were lit on top of the houses for the Fravashis to come. And I think in Yush, there was still, until 40 years ago, they were doing the same thing, where Nima Yushi's sort of hometown was there. So there were some of these older traditions, and traditions sometimes go out of the way, but in a different form survive and come to them.
And we've been getting a couple of questions about the term itself, Nowruz, and why Nowruz, why is it called Nowruz if it's the new year, and Nowruz is new day. And then we have a question of when does the term Nowruz appear in historical sources?
So in Western we have now Sarad. Sarad means year. So new year we already have in the Avesta, but not the term Nowruz. Okay. So there is this idea of a new year that was there. And Mary Boyce, a great scholar of Zoroastrian, had already suggested that this was probably, they should have had it. This was probably the Iranian Nowruz and so on. But again, textually, sort of being conservative, we don't see it obviously in the Avesta. Now Nowruz, as its Middle Persian sort of form, that's why I wrote N-O-W, because its Middle Persian form is Nowruz. But you can write it however you want, but don't like haggle on it if it should be other ways. It's the people in sort of Middle Persian literature and Sasanian time, they call these for calendar and history, they would say Mah and Ruz, Mah Farvardin, Nowruz. So this new of a Ruz means a new day, but just not the day that we think today. See, that's what we think. But the Raucha, a Ruz, is sort of a new beginning. It literally means a new beginning, not just a new day.
Taking it beyond the new day. A couple more questions. We have a lot of questions. Where are Iranian speaking countries? And then we also had a question of why the term Iranian speaking countries rather than Farsi speaking countries.
Okay, first of all, the last one. There's no term called Farsi in the English language. I should be adamant on that. This is a catastrophe. The term Farsi that has entered and plagued the West. Since Shakespeare, okay, since the Greek tradition, there has been Persian literature, there has been Persian carpet, there has been a Persian cat, there has been the Persian language. No Arab in its sort of wildest imagination comes to the US and say, I speak Al-Arabiya, okay? No French says, I speak Francais, okay? They speak French because the term French has a cultural value in English. Arabic, Arabian Nights, it has a cultural value to it, okay? So there's no Farsi, there's Persian, okay? Now, since I got off the sort of the thing with this Persian thing, which is a catastrophe, people cannot identify then the Persian Empire with the people who speak Persian. They think Farsi is, which is really something new that people from after revolution came whose English wasn't up to par. So they thought, what do I speak? I speak Farsi. I speak Farsi, yeah, but in English, the correct term is Persian, okay? But Iranian, relates to a much larger group of families. Linguistically, and this is not my division, it's been done in the West, but that's what linguistically it's followed. The Iranian speaking languages are a huge number in antiquity, and there's some today, of course, a good number of them. Luri, Kurdi, Farsi, Baluchi, Yaqnubi, Ishkhishmi, Tajiki, which is basically Tajiki and Daryaee are Persian. It's just a different dialect. It's not a different language. Okay. Qumzari, which is spoken in Oman. My colleague Richard Foltz has just finished a book on the Ossetians. Asi, that is right by the Republic of Ossetia, by Georgia, by the Black Sea. These people speak an Iranian language. Okay. Now, culturally, things are much wider and, of course, longer. That's why sort of the idea spread.
Mm. Yes, I agree. I will say there was one use, I would always say Farsi in my personal experience previously before grad school, because I think I think people think it shows that they're more cultured and they know that it's Farsi from this specific country.
No other people in the world that have come to the US have actually massacred their own term of their own language in English, except Iranians, which is really sad. No Japanese says, I speak Nopponese. Yeah, no one speaks Francais, nobody speaks Italiano. We speak Italian, Japanese, French, and we speak Persian.
Persian. Yes, and I make that argument. I actually make that argument with other Iranian Americans all the time. Of "Ma Farsi sohbat mikonam," I speak Persian. So yes, agreed with that emphatically. And then we have one comment here that it says, according to Wikipedia, 300 million people celebrate Nowruz worldwide. Do you think that's a conservative number or accurate?
It can make sense. Look, we have about 85 million in Iran, right? We got Kurds, another 20 million perhaps or more, all the way in Syria. So that's 100 million. Think of the East, in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, all the and Kyrgyzstan and all the places there. And then Afghanistan itself, right? One of the cultural centers of this Iranian world. And then people all around the world. It could make sense from 150, 200 to 300. Why not?
Yeah. We have a question about, celebrations of modern Nowruz specifically. Can you talk about Nowruz celebrations during the 1920s, 30s, and 40s through the monarchical rule under the Pahlavi dynasty? Could you please mention some remarkable celebrations if possible?
I cannot, because I wasn't living there at that time. However, what the Pahlavi dynasty does from the reign of Reza Shah is, as the project of, I think, modernization and modernism and state control, what you do is you want to homogenize and make things uniform. So what you have with the introduction of radio, later on with television, right? And creating a centralized system, you try to bring everybody together in sort of same ideas. So I would, when I was young, and my parents would remember probably what Nowruz meant was you listen to the radio before television, right? And someone came and gave a prayer, for example, read the Quran in the Pahlavi, and then there was a TikTok, and in Tehran there were cannons that were fired, right? But I'm sure in different places had different traditions, but the Pahlavis tried to create this as first of all, it was a national holiday, but certainly promote it on a larger scale, right? So that was absolutely done the case in the Pahlavi reign, as opposed to the Islamic Republic tradition.
Mm-hmm. And then present day, how has globalization and the use of mass media affected the traditions of Nowruz?
What it has is, first of all, it's brought to attention to people in the West to some extent, and it's bringing more and more that beside Christmas and Hanukkah and these other celebrations, there is another one called Nowruz and Kwanzaa, right? So Nowruz is another one, and it's celebrated by a lot of people, as our friend from Wikipedia said, 300 or 200 million. That's nothing small. It's a beautiful celebration of spring. It doesn't, as right now, we don't attach it to specific religion, most of us, right? It's just the coming of regeneration of life and beauty. So it could be celebrated. And I've just done so many interviews that, and articles that have come out because of this globalization and the mass media, that people are, they do see this. I just gave a talk for, I think it was, yeah, I'm not going to name it, but for a big media company, right, or a communications company, that Google. So they want to know and they want to share it, right? All the Iranians who work in Google now want to share this with their Google staff. So I think as time goes on, this will become even more of interest and importance.
And taking it to present day, I think everyone's Nowruz this year is going to look very different from last year. I think we're in a different place of the world yet last year. How is the coronavirus, or how will it continue to affect
Well,
Nowruz?
I just had my first jab, so I'm waiting for the second virus or the vaccine.
Nice, congratulations.
Thank you. As an educator, I'm tier 2.
Amazing.
So I got that. I just got it. What happens is, of course, there's a didani. That is to go to visit family and friends coming. With the current issues, it's a little bit iffy, right? And really uncomfortable. So it's becoming a much more solemn sort of family, immediate family celebration, right? Because of the pandemic that exists. Perhaps people who have had the vaccine, maybe because now suddenly this is sped up in the past, I think, month, you might be able to get a couple of your families to see. You ask them, have you had your vaccine? Can I see your vaccination sort of permit? And see them. Otherwise, it's become, I think, much more private.
Mm-hmm. And because I know even Iranian President Rouhani was saying Eid Didani, but with mask Eid Didani. We have a couple of minutes left. I have a question about Sabzi Polomahi and its and its significance. I will say I think we have excellent food in the Iranian community. Sabzi Polomahi, what is its significance and why around Nowruz?
So again, Sabzi Polomahi is a recent phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
People on the Iranian plateau did not consume fish on a large scale. It's by the Caspian, and you should remember the Persian Gulf, and Sea of Oman, that people consume fish, because it couldn't have survived unless you dried the fish, right? So we should remember that. It was with technology, centralization, and I would contend, again, it's a more recent phenomena to get the white fish, my sefidam, my didi from Shomal. If you're in Tehran, I think if you're in the south, you may have different fish as well, right? And have the sabzi polomahi for the sal tahvil, whichever. But it's not old, at least on the Iranian plateau. I don't know when it started, but I would say it's with when you can bring the fish without getting it actually going back to Tehran in the long distances. So that means it should be a modern phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. We have a couple of questions as far as traditions around Nowruz. I'm going to ask just the final question. I thank you for your time, Dr. Daryaee. AD and the giving of AD. Who gives AD? When did that start? I know you showed the coins. Is it older to younger? Is it?
Yeah, so I think it was different and everybody got it. So the idea is, I think, at least in the Sasanian times, the king were told, according to Jahiz and other sources, that the king came and for several days sat, held court. At first, it was actually, it's a reciprocity. It's giving and taking. And for the state, that would make sense, that the king would bestow gifts and the people then would bestow gifts on the king. It's a reciprocity process. And then throughout time, we see that, of course, nowadays the elder give the younger people that AD, or the sort of the present. But we don't have evidence for the earlier period. We just know that the court and the people gave to each other different types of actually.
Okay, I promise, final question. What's your favorite Nowruz tradition you hope lasts for futures, modern or ancient otherwise? Your favorite Nowruz tradition?
Yeah, I mean, my favorite besides Sabzi Polomai Khordan, which may be local, it's really a didani, when you get to see family. I think that's important, especially for us living in the West and these sort of modern conditions that, people are scattered throughout different places, regions. Of course, now there's Zoom, as we can see. To be able to actually still be connected, to not lose that human touch. I think I'm getting older, but I feel that we're losing the human touch and communication of sort of personal.
Yes, yes, I think that was a beautiful point to end on, especially given our time here. I want to thank you so much, Dr. Daryaee, for
My
joining us.
pleasure.
I want to thank everyone out there for joining us. We had over 200 folks log on and join us here. Thank you for your participation and continued support in our events. We'll have more events on April 23rd. Please be on the lookout for the Canticles of the Birds. Thank you again. On behalf of the Georgetown Persian Studies program, Nowruzetan Piruz, Har Ruzetan Nowruz.
خداحافظ. نوروز مبارک.